None of this is true. The long and short of it is, Ukraine army is being badly beaten and the war is virtually over now.
Hello there. Now, you may not agree with him, but Godfrey Bloom does not beat about the bush as he gives us his geopolitical assessment of the Ukraine situation. I was kindly invited by the leader of the English Democrats, Robin Tilbrook, to attend their annual meeting over the weekend. And part of the proceedings was a geopolitical update on Ukraine by the straight-talking former UKIP MEP Godfrey Bloom. An update that might well surprise you. As well as being a prize-winning fund manager, Bloom is also a published author on the subjects of military history and the Austrian School of Economics. He's also seen service with the army, and his specialist subjects are logistics and geopolitical military strategy. And he gave us his views on Ukraine in his usual, energetic and forthright fashion. So without further ado, over to Godders.
Well, it's a great pleasure. Can everybody hear me okay with this machine? Right. What can I say that's going to help? First of all, I know a lot of you, I'm a big supporter, of course, of the English Democrats, as you well know, so I'm a big supporter of yours. But I did promise that my wife, after my time at UKIP, I would never join another political party. So I'm a supporter, if not a member. Now, what you may or may not know is that I had a very undistinguished military career. I was started in light armoured reconnaissance and I finished with 4th Armoured Division in logistics. So that is my sort of hands-on side of my military. As I say, totally and utterly undistinguished. Such medals as I have were for turning up. Not doing anything there, no deeds of daring do. But I also am a graduate in geopolitical military history. And so I have been I watch all past and present campaigns. And, I'm a military historian, I have been published. And I take a great interest in these matters. And I've taken a particular interest because it is the here and now and live, isn't it, in Ukraine. Now, I have never seen in my life, and I was born in 1949, I have never seen a propaganda campaign such as I have seen in the last 3 years. We have seen not one word of truth on our mainstream media. It is quite disgraceful, and if you want to listen to the other side, it's been stopped because you can't get any of Putin's speeches on Russia Today in order to make up your own mind. So we've been cut off from any information which isn't actually mainstream media and the government and the BBC. And of course the BBC won its spurs, if you will, in the last war for its impartiality as far as it could be in wartime. So the BBC actually won its reputation by telling the truth, even through the difficulties of war. Now we don't see that. Any form of dissent is completely verboten. And I saw the other day, you may well have seen it, an 800-word op-ed by Ben Wallace in the Daily Telegraph. I have never seen so much scandalous lying in my life. It is disgraceful. He is telling us one last push and Ukraine army is going to win. He's talked about 500,000 Russian casualties and the loss of 2,500 armoured vehicles. None of this is true. The long and short of it is, Ukraine army is being badly beaten and the war is virtually over now. Now, what we need to do is understand how this came about. How did this come about? How did this crazy, unnecessary, criminal war come about, one wonders? Well, it is about regime change. So you can trace it back further than 2008, but 2008 is a good time to go back to. where it became policy of Washington's policy and its puppet NATO, because NATO is simply just a puppet of the neocons in Washington. Now, I speak as an ex-obviously NATO member, NATO supporter. In the days of the Soviet Union, the NATO was a very good thing. NATO protected us from a rather unpleasant regime, a heavily militarized regime, the Soviet Union. Those days have gone now. They've gone. What we can't seem to understand is that the Soviet Union is no more. And we can't move on in this country. We have to move on. Washington has to move on. European nations in NATO have to move on. It is in our advantage to have a peaceful relationship and trade with Russia, which is the biggest country in the world and has unbelievable natural resources. It was us that actually triggered sanctions against the Russian Federation to the cost of ordinary people in Western Europe. The big shots on their index-linked pensions, their index-linked salaries, they don't suffer. They're not suffering from any of this. They've still got plenty of money. They're still going about their business. It's the little people. And of course, the Germans are now beginning to understand that, the German people, as they become slowly de-industrialized, in the same way that next zero is trying to de-industrialize us in this country. So it started around about 2008, and the whole concept of a neutral Ukraine, which was heavily supported before that time, it was a great buffer state. And as you know, big powerful countries like Russia like buffer states around them. It gives them a sense of security, and that is perfectly right and natural. And of course, if you go back to 1964, President Kennedy was quite clear that he would not accept missiles in Cuba. He would not accept missiles just off the Florida coast. And of course, those of you old enough to remember, not many I suspect, I was a teenager at the time, realized that that was a perfectly natural response from the United States. And the Soviet Union withdrew their missiles, and deals were done behind the scenes for actually the Americans to withdraw some of their missiles from Turkey, which of course is also a NATO member. So a lot of this goes on behind the scenes when we had something which totally forgotten about now, which is called diplomacy. We don't do diplomacy anymore. And the Americans have made no secret that they are after regime change in the Russian Federation, as indeed they were in Libya, the Horn of Africa, Iraq, Afghanistan. The list is virtually endless of the neocons in Washington wanting regime change. And everywhere they've been, they've made a balls of. Every single country that they've been and interfered in and then left has been left in a terrible mess. And this has been going on globally since Vietnam. Now, you've got to understand the concept of propaganda. The Americans realized in Washington, I call the Americans, I've got lots of American friends, I'm not anti-American, that would be ridiculous. I'm anti-Washington neocons, can we get that straight? And incidentally, I'm not a particular supporter of the Russian Federation. What I want is, I'm a big believer in peace and trade. That's what I'm after. So we've got to understand these things for the good of all of us. But of course, what are we going to do about this situation of regime change, this constant regime change that the neocons in Washington made? A neutral Ukraine was good for everybody, and that was NATO policy, certainly up until 2008. This is no conspiracy theory. You've only got to listen to the speeches being made by Newland and Blinken and Biden and all the other people in Washington, and they're on the platform every single day saying that it has to be regime change, we have to get rid of these this evil Russian Federation, we have to get rid of Putin, so on and so forth. You might ask yourself, why is that the case? It's so the powers behind the scenes, like BlackRock and Vanguard, of whom we know very little, want to plunder the Ukraine, which is one of the richest countries in Europe, certainly as from an agricultural perspective. We know that. It's very, very rich soil, and it's about the size of Texas. And it's an extremely valuable piece of real estate, if you will, and of course the big corporations can't wait to plunder it. And this is what it's all about. And of course, they worked on that in 2014. And then in 2019, Zelensky was elected with the backing of Washington, and he stood on the ticket of friendship and with the Russian population, the ethnic Russians within the Ukraine. And this is what he supported, and he got elected on that basis. He immediately changed round. He immediately changed that, and of course, his forces in the western Ukraine started attacking and killing people with shell fire and so on and so forth in the eastern Donbass, or the eastern Ukraine. So this is how it all kicked off, and we have seen the extension of NATO. And the promise was, when the Warsaw Pact countries fell, that we would not extend NATO. In fact, I would argue that we didn't need NATO at all. When the Warsaw Pact countries had finished, there was no need for NATO. There was no role for NATO. And I say, not an anti-NATO person. Goodness me, I spent enough time out in Germany with 4th Armoured Division, freezing on the border, in favour of NATO, supporting NATO. But times have changed. Times have changed, and we have to move on. So what are we going to do about this terrible situation? How can we deal with this? And of course, the encroachment of NATO has gone right up through the Baltic states. It's gone right up to the Russian, Lithuania, Estonia, Romania. All these ex-Warsaw Pact countries now have American boots on the ground and American missiles. And you've got to look at it from another point of view. You've got to look at it from the Russian perspective. And I used to do the classes under Professor Donnelly, who was a Soviet expert, Professor Chris Donnelly, when I was at Sandhurst. And he used to explain how the Russians think. You've got to think like a Russian. Where are they coming from? What is their perspective? Well, if you look at a world map and you fill in United States bases, overseas bases, they have 200,000 overseas personnel and 800 overseas bases. What do you think the Russians are going to think? And it's getting closer and closer and closer. And now the Ukraine, where they have 1,000 miles of border on the Russian Federation border. And they're saying, no, thus far and no further. We also want the ethnic Russians in the east of the Ukraine to be protected and looked after, which was part of the Minsk agreement, sponsored by the United Nations, which of course the Ukrainians, the West Ukrainians under Zelensky, sponsored by America, have gone against. So we have this situation that they've broken all the rules, and we saw then, did we not, Angela Merkel admit that the reason that they lied and cheated at Minsk II was to give them more time to build up the Ukrainian army and arm them and train them. And this is no conspiracy theory, this is right up front, and she's admitted it. Not that you'd ever find the BBC reporting that, of course, but she's actually admitted that they lied, and so the Russians are saying, how can you trust these people? We can't even sit down and negotiate with these people because they lie, and they admit they're lying. So this is the problem. And the Ukraine army was built up into the biggest army in Europe. It was built up to hundreds of thousands of men, and if you remember that our British army now is down to 70,000 men, so our army is getting smaller and smaller. So we had this imbalance, but anyway, the sponsorship of Washington was for the Ukraine army to push further west, and the Russians said no, thus far no further, and the Russians, with a very small proportion, a very small army of only about 90,000 men pushed in to protect the people in the Donbass on the eastern side of the Ukraine, thinking that if they moved in, that would bring Washington and Kiev to the negotiating table. That was the thought behind it. And of course, to a certain extent, that it did, because there was a deal cut in February or March of 2022. That deal was cut, and it was signed. And there could have been peace 18 months ago in Ukraine. But that did not suit the Washington neocons. So they got their puppet, Boris Johnson, to fly immediately to Kiev to tell them to fight on, and they will be provided with absolutely everything they needed in order to beat the Russian Federation, and they could win, and there'll be absolutely no limit to the amount of money that there would be poured in and weapons poured in to Ukraine. And they bought it. I personally would arraign Boris Johnson and sent him to prison for a very long time, because since that time we have seen the death of over 200,000 young Ukrainian soldiers. Absolutely scandalous. I'd have him shot. I'd have him shot. This is an absolutely bloody disgrace. I'd be interested to know just the unaudited budget of the CIA, how much he got for that. And if you remember in the House of Commons, his very last sentence, he said, I'll give you one tip, please do this. His last in the House of Commons was, stay close to America. How much did he get for saying that, one wonders. And of course now, where are we? Well, the Russian Federation has built up an army now of something like 400,000 active and another 400,000 in reserve. Their integrated battle systems are infinitely superior to NATO's. It's all, they're spy in the sky, it's linked in with artillery, there's no shortage of shells, they can produce as many shells, as many weapons as they can, as many missiles as they can. It makes you wonder what happened, does it not, to the Western defence budget, the American defence budget, which is $1 trillion a year. The Russian Federation spends 5% of that, and yet NATO's taking a spanking out there. But the problem is, of course, it's the never-ending war, because no Americans are coming back in body bags. It's only dead Ukrainians. Who cares about dead Ukrainians? Not the neocons in Washington. So it drones on and it drones on and it goes on. And from a tactical perspective in the field, the Russian Federation have a three-tier defense system, which actually, there's nothing new about this at all. There's a three-tier defense system. You have interlocking fire, you have all sorts of defensive positions, and we've seen all this kind of thing. I mean, not that different from, one might argue, the Maginot Line or the Hindenburg Line, going back all those years. Now, the difference is, of course, that the Russians have total air superiority and superiority of the spy in the sky, satellite views, all interlocked in a military way. The Ukrainians are attacking the Russian Federation lines in much the same way in the Great War we attacked the German lines, just throwing bodies at it. We were just throwing bodies at the machine guns and taking terrible losses. So this is a position that we're in. And of course, it's the Ukrainians who are attacking, are taking these huge losses. Arguably, and it's difficult to get accurate figures, but it's looking in the tune of 400,000, and for a population in Ukraine which is relatively small, started a population of only maybe 30 million, that's very heavy hits indeed. So what we have now is a situation where virtually the military war is over and we should be seeking a peace. How are we going to get peace out of this when the Russians can't sit down with NATO and discuss, what's best to go from here? It's very, very difficult if you're sitting down to negotiate a peace when you can't be trusted and already you admitted that you lied last time round. So the prognosis, I would argue, and I'll take questions in a minute, is you will find that the Russians will now, which for them is an existential war as far as they're concerned, they regard this as being vital to the survival of the Russian Federation. With America, it's just another nice-to-have war, which supports, of course, the billions of dollars going into the industrial military congressional complex, of which Eisenhower reminded us in 1960, and I'm quite sure you'll be familiar with that speech, that they're now, the main thing is the money that goes out there, and if you look back to 3 years ago, I think it was, the front page of The Guardian, my favourite newspaper, and yours, I'm sure, said Ukraine is the most corrupt country in Europe, by miles, possibly the world. It's a dung heap as far as corruption is concerned. So millions and billions are being poured in and incidentally 4 billion or 5 billion of our taxpayers, your taxpayers' money. And what do we see? Well, first of all, we're seeing weapons turn up in Mexico. The weapons that they're buying, they're turning up in Africa. So this money's already being siphoned off. And then they actually sack the Minister of Defence for having his hand in the till, and they even noticed it in Ukraine, that's how bad he was. Is he in prison? They sent him here to the Court of St James as an ambassador for Ukraine. And of course he'll be welcomed gladly by our King, King Charles III, of course, who's got WEF strapped to his underpants. So you have all this, they all piss in the same pot, if the ladies will excuse me. This is the sort of situation we've got. So how's it going to progress here? Well, the Ukrainian army is basically beaten. There's no more that NATO can give. There's no more than NATO countries can give. We're seeing demonstrations hostile to NATO in Germany and Italy, and we're seeing actually regime changes in places like Slovakia. People are beginning to push back about this. Again, you will never see any of this on the BBC. You won't see this on the BBC, these demonstrations, but it's happening, and I suspect we're going to see some big changes in the Polish and the German elections. And what can the Russians do, what the Russian Federation do to feel secure in their borders with that 1,000 miles? The next thing, they will take Kharkov, for those of you who are looking at it and this in any depth, they will take Kharkov and they will take Odessa. They cannot leave Odessa. It's a massive port. It's like us winning the United Kingdom back and leaving Southampton as a free port or something like that. They have to take Kharkov because it's on the flank, and they have to take Odessa. But I don't want to go too deep into tactics. Weather? Well, what's the weather situation going to be? We're coming into the rainy season in Ukraine, and the reason that there's been a few ifs and buts on this last year was because we didn't get the freeze. And you can't move armour without the freeze. You need hard ground. You can't move it through mud. But I have checked it out, and I have been told by some of the friends I made in the old days at college and my friends in various military places, which are all getting old now, but they still got access to good information, is that you can invest Kharkov even in the rainy season, because all they need to do is surround it and invest it and wait for it to fall. In order to move west, they're going to need the hard ground, and it's expected this year there will be hard ground, there will be a freeze. But sooner or later they will have to take this, and there will be no negotiations, particularly on both sides. It will be the Russians will say, this is how it's going to be. This is how it's going to be. That's after, then by that stage will be round about 500,000 young Ukrainians dead. A war, as most wars are, I did my dissertation when I graduated it wasn't actually titled The Futility of War, but most wars are futile. Most wars are a waste of blood and treasure. And this is a particularly criminal war, and with the sort of nonsense that Ben Wallace and the commander of the British Armed Forces today, General Sanderson, are lying, the Daily Telegraph's lying. Older members here will remember the standard of the Daily Telegraph defence correspondents, which Claire Hollingworth and John Keegan, you'll remember those internationally appreciated experts. Now we have Jobsworths who are just peddling the party line, unipolar party line from Washington. Just up until last year, the defence correspondent of the Times was Lucy Fisher. Now I know Lucy Fisher, she's a nice girl and damn shit hot on handbags. But really, defence for the Times, for the Thunderer, come on. So, and Beale at the BBC, I've always fallen out with Beale. He doesn't know an able seaman from a regimental sergeant major. And these guys are actually the ones reporting back to you. And it's lies and lies, and it's challenge. Dissent is not allowed. Dissent is verboten. And they learned this from Vietnam. The Americans learned this from Vietnam. They cannot have somebody going against the line, because then you get a movement in universities, you get people coming out and demonstrating on the streets, so on and so forth. You have to crush it. And of course, those of you who have ever read a biography of Goebbels, he said there's some pillars of propaganda. No dissent, and one lie. If you go on repeating the lie long enough and it's big enough lie, it will become received wisdom, and you can help it along with some celebrities as well. And of course we've seen the whole propaganda exercise for the climate as well. Climate change is just the same, isn't it? It's one great propaganda lie, and dissent is totally verboten. So my prognosis here is I would expect the Russians to invest Kharkov probably by the end of October, and they will have to move west probably if the ground freezes, and they'll certainly take Odessa at the first opportunity, and I suspect that will be sooner rather than later. Thank you.